Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Well, welcome to episode 547 for August 14th, 2023, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us this week, everybody, as everyone is anticipating a big week or a big show this week as we review The Blind Side. Everyone, their favorite movie.
Man, yeah. If that movie wasn't already frowned upon for some of its notorious Oscar wins, it's going to be reevaluated now for sure.
Well, that is hilarious to me because, yes, there are a lot of people that already don't like that movie for, one, its Oscar wins, and probably undeserved Oscar love.
Yeah.
It's white savior exploitation, put a lot of, like, a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. Mm-hmm. And now, for those that did like the movie, such as my lovely wife, you have now alienated them as well. So, like, now this movie is for nobody.
Which is a shame. Like, okay, like, I'm being hard on the movie, but I don't hate the movie. I've always actually found it, rather enjoyable for what it was. I mean, I can enjoy it, but now it's kind of hard to enjoy it knowing the context of what Michael Oher is actually saying publicly now. With regard to the quote-unquote adoption at the center of it.
For clarity for those listening that don't know,
right?
Michael Oher, who is the subject of The Blind Side, he came out publicly to say that the family depicted in the movie, they actually did not adopt him officially. Instead, they put him in a conservatorship and deprived him of millions of dollars, because this is a movie that did very well financially, and off royalties, I think they've made somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million, to which he has seen zero of that money. And yeah, I mean, he had a successful-ish NFL career, so he has money from that, but it's not about whether he has money now or not, because it isn't a fascinating story. I understand why they would want to turn it into a movie, but it's about the fact that he was absolutely deprived from this family. And it seems as if what the heart of that movie was supposed to be about love and having empathy for this kid, maybe that actually wasn't true. Instead, let's exploit this guy and just take him for all of his money and all of his value.
There is one joke in the movie that I can only imagine gaining more popularity now that this is happening. And not to say I agree or even disagree with it, but that moment when Kathy Bates' character says, "I'm a Democrat," that is going to go all on his...
Yeah. I mean, it's not great. I mean,
not a good look. It's not a good look.
It's not a good look. I mean, maybe we'll get some more details as the court proceedings unfold, but man, got to feel for Michael Oher. And he's already on the record of talking about, and this could be a whole podcast episode on its own, the idea of art and how that affects people in real life, positively or negatively. We've talked about how art is this tool that allows people to cope or to grieve or to see the world in a different way. That's what I love so much about art. But there's instances like this where this movie comes out and it's had such a detrimental impact on Michael Oher's life. Yeah. He's talked about that a lot over the years. Even when he was an active NFL player, that the movie was a hindrance to him. It just it's something that has just completely put a shackle hold on his life. And then this comes out. Yeah. So, I mean, this movie's just been nothing but headaches for the guy.
Yeah.
I feel bad.
I feel bad. I really do. I mean, he's been retired for what, like 7 years at this point?
Has
I think
it been
he played
that long?
I think he played his last game in like 2016 or something like that. Maybe
It's been a
2017.
while.
I mean, I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, listeners, because sometimes we don't know our sports history as much as our film history. But yeah, to think that he has been dealing with that for even that long when he's been out of the game. I mean, it just goes to show, to your point, that sometimes art can be a therapy tool, but sometimes it can also be a weapon.
Absolutely.
And that's a scary thought.
And it says here he last played in 2016 before being released in 2017. So yeah, you are correct, or at least in the right neighborhood. That's for sure. So at any rate, that's a disheartening story that will
absolutely
evolve as the court proceedings unfold. However, we are here to talk about something else entirely, but equally saddening.
Yeah, it's a pretty sad episode. But we're going to try and find something to celebrate within this conversation.
We're going to celebrate here and have a lot of fun talking about William Friedkin, who passed away last week on my birthday, August 7th, at the age of 81?
87.
87.
He was 87 years old. Yeah.
So, yeah, he lived a good long life and obviously made some incredible movies that we're going to talk about here with William Friedkin. I guess before we get into any of the film specifically, do you have any thoughts about him broadly as a filmmaker?
I think he's one of the most challenging filmmakers of his time, and even still of the more modern era, especially with regard to some of his later films when he started adapting the works of playwright Tracy Letts, who we know as an actor nowadays as well. He was not afraid to really challenge audiences. His movies always felt kind of dangerous. You know what I mean? Like he took chances that it almost felt like he was not allowed to do. And you could sense that in his, in his various interviews that he would give. He was not afraid to speak his mind. Have you ever heard the story of when he was asked about The Exorcist 2?
I'm not sure if I know that one.
Well, I'm not going to state the whole story because it's best to hear it from his own mouth.
Sure.
But long story short, he was asked whether he had seen any of the other Exorcist films, the sequels specifically, and he very bluntly said no. Said he watched like 2 minutes of Exorcist 2 and saw someone riding on a bee, and he said, "What the hell is this?" But there was more to that story with regard to the producers of that film and the story of going to see the premiere of it and the reaction that the crowd reciprocated towards it. I'll leave it at that because you need to hear it from Friedkin's mouth. It is one of the greatest premiere stories I think I've ever heard.
That's wild.
It's hilarious. Yeah, but yeah, like to get back to the overall point about William Friedkin, he was someone that was just not afraid to speak his mind, and that sense of being a challenging figure and not being afraid to challenge people came through in his films as well. And I've always appreciated that about him. And even in some of his lesser films that we'll also talk about, there's a brutality to all of them, as if that he just he doesn't want to play fair. He's not there to play it safe. And you sense that in pretty much every film that he ever directed, which is what I've always appreciated about him.
Yeah, no, I completely echo a lot of what you're saying. I mean, this is a man who absolutely loved to challenge audiences, loved to be subversive in some really compelling ways. He was an artist who understood the importance of, let's say, cinematography and sound and how those things are connected deeply to tone and tension. I mean, his films are so often brooding and urgency and paranoia and fright and this overwhelming sense of do anything at all costs. And I love how the craft of his films tap into all of that so vividly, especially when tethered to the writing of his characters, the performances we see on display, and how he went about channeling, the depths of these characters inside the confines of these storytelling tropes and confines. And it's just a terrific filmmaker. I very much look forward to getting into all of these films of his. And it is interesting you're talking about how he has this I don't give a shit attitude and I'm going to do it my way. One, it is really funny. There's been a lot of clips going around on film Twitter at the very least that have been great to revisit. We think of the moment when he's talking about Al Pacino. Working with him and Cruising. And what's so funny to me about that is the timing of it, because Cruising is a movie that came out in the early 80s, I believe, like 1980.
It was 1980 specifically, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So you think about Pacino's output in the 70s and how legendary that is.
Yeah.
Like, in 1980, like we're coming off the heels of Al Pacino at his very best. It's not like we're talking about Al Pacino, let's say, throughout the 90s.
In Scent of a Woman or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're talking about a guy who is at the top of his craft. And but here's William Friedkin going, no, he was lazy compared to these other guys that worked with. What?
Which almost could be like inadvertent praise, right? The fact that he just naturally has it. He doesn't have to try to act. He just knows what he's doing.
Yeah, I mean, it could be praise to Al Pacino because maybe he was that way on The Godfather and
I mean, I don't know. If William Friedkin ever called me lazy, I would take it as a compliment as well.
Yeah, I mean, I just
came
find
from
that
William
so
Friedkin's
funny.
mouth. That's all I care about.
Absolutely, but I love his ego and overconfidence and all of that, or maybe that is the truth. I mean, who knows? I don't know anything about Al Pacino's, the way he works his craft and prepares for characters and whatnot. But I do love Friedkin in that he wasn't afraid to say what was on his mind. Because one, it's funny, and then also because he's really great at his job. He's a great filmmaker, and he knows what he's doing. He knows what he wants, and that's probably part of the conflict. He walks into a film and goes, "This is what we're doing, and I need you to do this." And Pacino, not prepared for that, maybe, leads to, a work that isn't as fulfilling as maybe some of his others, and maybe that's where Friedkin is coming from there. I don't know, but I love that confidence, and you want that in a filmmaker. You don't want them to be, exploitative. You certainly don't want them to be, overbearing, because we've seen many times how toxic that's been, and that can lead to conflict and bad things. But this is a filmmaker that, he knew what he wanted, and he had great relationships from what I can tell with a lot of the other actors.
A lot of people respected him because of that attitude.
Yeah, exactly.
And we don't often praise directors by describing them as people who are willing to compromise, right? That's not something we usually say. And Friedkin is literally the opposite end of that. He refused to compromise. Even in films that we may talk about here that could have easily been a director for hire kind of situation, he did not do that. Even in situations where he may have been, he still made those films his own, for better and for worse. And I really respected that.
Well, where do you want to start? Should we start with The Exorcist? I want to say that's his biggest film. That's the one that people might think first. Yeah,
between that and The French Connection, I would say, because I feel like those are two of the most defining films of the 1970s. For many others could certainly fall into that category, but within his own filmography, the way that they both sort of revolutionized their respective genres, with The French Connection, obviously, with the action film genre, that wonderful car chase that's in that film. That I mean, it's one of the greatest car chases of all time. It really is. And then, of course, what The Exorcist did with the horror genre, which you can maybe argue that some of the horror tropes might not hold up as much because of the I guess just the what you can get away with physically from a special effects standpoint at the time. But why I think The Exorcist works so well is that I've never considered that a horror film. I've always considered that more of a horrific drama. And that's why that film has always stood the test of time for me. It is my favorite Friedkin film. It's one of my all-time favorite films. And a lot of that is because I watch it every single time and it feels like a different movie every time, which I believe British critic Mark Kermode has also said about the film, and I do agree with him on that. You could watch it as this beautiful relationship movie between a mother and daughter and how devastating that is. You can also watch it as a movie of faith versus evil when you look at it from Father Maron's perspective, or Father Maron is played by Max von Sydow, or Jason Miller's character, Father Karras. It's about loss of faith. So you have like it literally is an ensemble piece, because each subsequent story is basically its own narrative within an overarching story, which makes it one of the best layered and well-told movies from a scripting standpoint as well. So I think both those movies perhaps might be Friedkin's best work because of what they did for their respective genres, especially The Exorcist, because it takes itself so seriously, and it's hard for a movie in that kind of horrific vein to successfully do that as well as it does.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating about The Exorcist And this actually tethers quite heavily to what you're talking about there, especially when you look at this film within the filmography of Friedkin at the time, right? Because this comes out in between The French Connection and Sorcerer.
Yeah.
And even when you look at much of his films that come out later, To Live and Die in L.A., we'll talk about The Hunted, Killer Joe, you know, a lot of the other films that are kind of in between. But I think what's interesting about The Exorcist, comparatively to a lot of those films, and they're great for reasons that we'll talk about, but William Friedkin was excellent at taking cinematic tropes and utilizing those to his advantage. And so his films are often extremely vibrant. They're full of tension and paranoia. The cinematography is lush and exquisite. He gets some incredible scores in his movies. I mean, these are the kind of movies you go to the cinema for. You want to see these on the big screen. He makes you feel his movies. They're like a great punch in the face.
They are, yeah.
And I love that, because not only do you get the visceral quality, the craft that comes with his filmmaking, but he was equally subversive. Earlier, you opened up by talking about how challenging of a filmmaker he is, and absolutely, he loved to end with ambiguity, for example. And he also
like to make audiences feel unpleasant, right?
Yes.
I don't think any of his movies have a pleasant vibe to them. It's to the point that if someone out there getting into movies in general were to watch all of Friedkin's films, even his classics, and say, I hated all of them, I don't know if I would be surprised, honestly, because they are very polarizing, which I guess is kind of a dry word at this point now with regard to anything that could be subversive, right? But Friedkin tried to do that. It was almost like his MO in many ways.
Yeah, and look, I find that breathtaking. I love that about his movies, that he is challenging. He's willing to subvert tropes or, you know, tackle them in a new and different way, but also channel why audiences respond to cinema. He was really great at finding and threading that needle perfectly. And I bring all of that up to say, The Exorcist is this incredible outlier in the sense that the craft is there. The cinematography of this film, you can watch this on mute, and it is utterly engrossing.
Yeah.
It is gorgeous to look at.
Sometimes it does not feel like a film from 1973.
It really doesn't. I mean, this film is incredible to look at. There's an iconic musical cue with this film as well. What really separates The Exorcist, I feel like, from a lot of his other movies are the performances. There's something about Jason Miller and Ellen Burstyn specifically that to me is so striking in this movie, and somber. You know, you have Chris's dire thirst for answers that is so deeply felt. The way Miller taps into religious indignancy is really powerful, and how those two things collide at the end of the film. Yes, it is a little intense from a filmmaking perspective, and you know, there's the horror, the quote unquote horrorness of it all. But what's really remarkable is less that, although I respect the craft, it's the performances that drive it more than anything else. And while I still have a few blind spots, so this might not be entirely true, but of all the movies I've seen, this is the one I would say more than anything else is performance driven. And
and that's not to undercut what Friedkin is doing as a filmmaker.
No, absolutely not.
If those performances were any less great, the film is still great. But there is an overarching sadness to this movie that I'm sure would have still been there, but I think it would have just been felt a little bit differently. One of my favorite examples in the movie, probably my favorite exchange in the whole movie, is right before the climactic end. Is a moment where Father Karras is simply sitting on the stairs, and Ellen Burstyn, Chris, comes over and just simply asks, is she going to die?
Yeah.
And Karras's response, the look on his face as he just says no, that right there, as a simple uttering of one word, was the completion of that character's arc. It's absolutely mesmerizing. Like, it is a devastating movie, and that's why I keep going back to it. Like I don't see it as a horror movie. It has creepy and horrific things, but it's because it is so devastating. That is why the horror works.
And I agree. I think from both of those angles, both being Father Karras and this religious indignancy that he feels, how Miller taps into that, I think, is exquisite. It's just really terrific.
Yeah.
And there's something about the somberness of it, the subtlety of it. I mean, you know how I love an internalized performance, and that is a lot of what he's doing here. But
I think he gives one of the greatest performances of the 1970s, Jason Miller.
I don't disagree with that. I think it is striking. But here's the thing, right? Because we talk about this duality that, yes, I personally love and often respond to these reflective performances, this channeling of emotion internally and saying so much without saying anything at all. That is some of my personal favorite art. However, there are great performances that can be much, much louder than that. Enter in Ellen Burstyn because there are.
I thought you were about to say Linda Blair, but I mean, to be fair, Ellen Burstyn. Yeah, I mean that's kind of an unfair.
It is very
hilarity
unfair
there. Yeah,
yeah, but Ellen Burstyn is this mother who is incredibly, deeply desperate, and I love how that comes through. Like that scene with the doctors when she just completely goes off. Like, what is wrong? What do I have to do? Even that first moment she has with Karras. She's like, are you going to help me or not? Like, what's going, like, can you do this? Like, she's very brazen about what she wants, and she doesn't have an answer. Like, these doctors don't have an answer. Can they perform this exorcism? Is that a thing? Because Karras's rebuttal is, this is a practice that is from like 1732. Like, this doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And she does not give a damn. Like, she just wants an answer. She just wants help. Can someone please help me? Will you help me? Yeah. And that desperation, I think comes through incredible in her performance.
It also takes a great director to know how to create a film that feels so controlled and almost procedural to make a big performance like that still feel grounded and of a piece with everything else.
And that's the big thing. It's not loud for the sake of being loud. It is rooted in a guttural humanity.
Yeah. Yeah, it absolutely is. And a lot of that is some of the storytelling choices that the film has. And a lot of that is credit to William Peter Blatty and his original novel, if a lot of these story beats were present in the novel as well, such as the MRI that Reagan has to get, which from what I remember, or at least from what I read, I think that was the scene that people were more or less running away from the theater during. Because it feels like the operational aspect of it feels even more visceral than something like a Saw movie, right? And I think that grounded nature and how that weirdly contradicts a performance like Ellen Burstyn's almost like pulls that performance in, kind of reins it in a little bit so it doesn't go fully off the rails. But I think that's also a credit to Burstyn for knowing and understanding the material itself to know when to pull that back herself too.
Exactly.
It's a perfect synergy of a director and writer knowing exactly what needed to be communicated and how to perform it. It's wonderful.
Absolutely. Because in that moment, from a filmmaking perspective, there is something about the grounded nature of it that, we're able to put ourselves in her shoes. And what I love about that sequence, despite how chilling it is visually, is this nice little cut to Chris in the window. And you get a nice little zoom in on Chris as she's watching this unfold. And it's one of the few moments that you can still sense the urgency in Chris, but she's also having to show a little patience and curiosity as to what is happening here. Yeah. But you get this zoom in on Chris that all at once demonstrates that sense of urgency, that demonstrates this desperation to find answers. And it's the one moment of the film where it is all self-reflective. She doesn't say anything
absolutely.
in the moment. So you do kind of get this balance of how loud she is, but also, again, channeling that humanity.
Oh, it's so good.
It's incredible.
So good.
And that, again, that's not to take anything away from the performances in some of these other movies. I mean, we'll talk about them as we go, because there's some phenomenal performances in these other movies.
Yeah.
But I don't know if, like, when I'm watching The French Connection or Sorcerer, which I definitely want to talk about, Live and Die in LA, like those movies, I don't think are performance driven. That's freaking driving those trucks, if you will. That's
nice work there. I will say, if there's any other comparative from a performance standpoint, maybe we can talk about Gene Hackman in The French Connection.
Yeah,
I think he's. I mean, to be fair, I will say I think I prefer his performance in something like The Conversation, the Francis Ford Coppola film. But again, that's a more performance-driven movie. So
I agree.
Yeah, so that one is elevated above The French Connection within that specific criteria.
That one is way more character driven
than
The French Connection, which is, again, working within the confines of a police procedural and action movie. So the level of characterization isn't quite there, but I do agree Hackman is able to still develop a fascinating character. But that's, again, where I would still say that's Friedkin behind the wheel that's driving that more than anything else. But it does come with a really great performance. And that certainly, I think, is the case more often than it isn't. And not just with his 70s output, but I think of McConaughey and Killer Joe, great performance in that, or Michael Shannon in Bug. Like, those are really great performances in vehicles where it's not Ellen Burstyn, The Exorcist good. And it's not performance driven in that way, but it comes with these great performances behind Friedkin kind of leading the charge.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes
That's
perfect
how I would
sense.
argue it.
It makes perfect sense. And I guess maybe we have to credit Friedkin for at least being a part of the reconnaissance, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because there were a few movies here that really helped reinvigorate our, I guess, interest in Matthew McConaughey from a serious standpoint. It was Dallas Buyers Club and even The Beach Bum afterwards that I guess really helped rein that idea home. But Killer Joe,
Interstellar.
Interstellar. Oh yeah, I forgot about Interstellar. That's a great point too. Probably could use that as a better example than something like The Beach Bum. I just happen to really like The Beach Bum.
I love that one too. I love it as well. Yeah.
But I mean, I never really described Matthew McConaughey as scary before, and he is pretty terrifying in Killer Joe. Especially in those final minutes, for sure.
And, because looking at his filmography here, speaking of McConaughey, okay, so, yes, like up till 2009, he's still stereotypical McConaughey.
He's still Fool's Golden.
He's still
he's still the guy that everyone wants to lose in 10 days.
Yes. But then you get to 2011. And there's the black comedy Bernie, Richard Linklater.
Oh yeah.
Where that is, we're starting to branch out. This is a little different. McConaughey.
Curtain was slowly lifting a little.
Curtain was slowly lifting, and then later on that year is when you get Killer Joe, and that's kind of where it begins, right? Because those two movies come out, and then the next year, that's when we get Mud. Yep. That's where we get Magic Mike. And then 2013, the reconnaissance is in full swing at that point. It's Dallas Buyers Club. It's The Wolf of Wall Street. He, of course, wins an Oscar. And there was also True Detective in 2013 as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, opposite Woody Harrelson. That's a good point.
And then 2014 is where you get Interstellar. So, in a lot of ways, it kind of starts with Friedkin.
And that's all within a span of like 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say from Bernie all the way through Interstellar, that was the height of the reconnaissance, I would say. That's how I would probably. And there's been some good stuff to come out since then, or after Interstellar, I should say, such as The Beach Bum.
Oh yeah. But it's again to bring this all back to William Friedkin. Not only was he a part of that reconnaissance, I wouldn't say he started it, but he was there in the early stages of it, though.
Yeah, very early stages. And even though I would say Bernie kind of introduced us to this new McConaughey, it was Killer Joe that really sprung it into life.
Yeah. I just rewatched Killer Joe in preparation for this conversation we're having here. That is a wild movie. I cannot help but say that is. I love it. I love it, but I would recommend it to like no one.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree. And that's a movie where it's brutal. It's again him being challenging, working within the confines of these tropes and almost reinventing them in a lot of ways. You get this incredible performance from McConaughey. And you know who else I love in that film is Emil Hirsch. He plays stupid almost too good.
Well, it's like the movie is kind of a comedy, right? And it's not just Emil Hirsch, but it's also Thomas Hayden Church, who is probably the more direct, dry comedian of the bunch, giving a very funny performance in that regard. But yeah, you're right. Emil Hirsch does play stupid. when that reveal comes, 2/3 of the way through the film, when he finally acknowledges and reveals where he learned about Killer Joe and all this stuff, it's like, dude,
you idiot.
Really?
But he's good at, he's good though at demonstrating the obtuseness of that character and just the flat out or ignorance of the character.
Yeah.
Like to a degree that's almost too effective. But I love that about that film and that character and that whole it's just crazy. It's crazy nonsense, but and again it kind of ends with a little ambiguity.
Yeah, that ambiguity, that has always been something I've been a little bit on the fence about, because it makes me think about the movie in a way where it's like, I'm not really sure what that was even about, but I kind of love that it chooses to just end that way. Again, it's Friedkin being a deliberate provocateur, and I love the sheer balls that he has about it.
I completely agree, and I also love how we're just really bouncing around here. Like I didn't even.
I don't mind that. I mean,
I know.
I don't mind the fact that there's little structure to this conversation.
Oh no, I agree.
Yeah,
it's just funny to me.
It is. I mean, we actually went down a slight rabbit hole and started talking about Matthew McConaughey for a little. So now I guess we have to be a little nicer to Jay and Ryan when we look back at their old extra film.
They have had an influence on the show. That is
sadly.
for sure.
Yeah.
But within the confines of him being a provocateur, and I actually love that about Killer Joe. I love that he's challenging, because I think of something like To Live and Die in LA, and there's the Richard Chance character, obviously played by William Peterson, and he's the character that we follow through the majority of this film. And spoiler alert, he is not the character that we end with. I love that kind of decision making.
There is so much narrative trickery in that movie that it almost feels like you're watching a full season of a television show condensed into 2 hours. And the whole final half almost feels like a singular action piece of a sorts. It's a very strange movie. It's one I do need to revisit sometime soon, because it's been quite a while since I've seen it, and apparently it's not even streaming anywhere. So it's one of those films that is hard to find. But based on my recollection, maybe we'll end this conversation by talking about like how we would rank some of our favorite William Friedkin films, at least those that we've seen. But I'll come out and say I think this movie, To Live and Die in LA, might be top 3 for me.
I love it. I actually did revisit this movie in preparation for this conversation.
Okay.
And man, I love the subversive qualities of this film. When we're talking about police procedurals, and in many ways it's the anti-French Connection and how Friedkin tackles this material. But I love how it opens with that classic trope of Captain, he's going to retire in 2 days. Let's celebrate him. And then last day on duty, guess what happens? He bites the bullet. Takes one right to the chest. And I love how the film leans into that trope. Like Friedkin is doing that very intentionally, because Richard's response to that is, I'm going to catch this guy. I'm going to catch Masters at all cost.
Yeah.
I don't care what I have to do. I'm going to break the law. And he's brazen about it. In fact, he's very prickly throughout a lot of this film. There's not many qualities about Chance that endears us to him.
Yeah.
If anything,
Peterson
and William Friedkin are doing the antithesis to that, which I admire.
Well, very rarely do we get legit heroes in a William Friedkin movie, right? Yeah. I mean, maybe you can argue The Exorcist being a little bit of an outlier, at least given the arc that Father Karras goes through, but he doesn't start out that way. He has to earn that redemptive arc. But for much of the movie, he's not really a good guy, nor is he a very good priest when you think about it.
No, he's a terrible priest. He flat out says at one point, I don't have faith anymore. I've lost it.
Yeah, but I'm still a priest. So yeah, go figure. But that is definitely a common trope of Friedkin, that he loves to portray people that don't fall into the typical hero versus villain spectrum. And in a way, it's almost like To Live and Die in LA is like him acknowledging that thesis and making a movie that is literally about that thing, because the film is almost directly addressing that blurred line between who are we supposed to root for in this world. And you don't really have an allegiance. You have an allegiance to them because they're interesting people, but you don't really have an allegiance to them as someone that you root for, right?
Yeah.
But they're still complex, and he really does a good job at that.
Yeah, and I love how that murky line never wavers. Like the film ends with that same complexity that we see at the beginning. The only thing that changes are the players.
Yeah.
Like if this story was to continue on, it would be the same issues, the same underlying problems are there, but now you have a new central character and a new villain to focus on. But it's the same shady, maneuverings on both sides of the coin. And a more conventional version of this, and this is why I bring up the trope of captain's about to retire and takes one to the chest on the last day, because a more conventional movie takes that idea and Chance becomes the hero. He gets his revenge in the end.
Yeah.
And how many times have we seen that? A bazillion.
Too many
Way
times.
too many.
Yeah.
And Friedkin is like, nope, we're not doing that because it's not that easy. Yeah. And when you're breaking the law like Chance does, and you're skirting ethics the way that he does, there is only one end to that.
Yep.
And that's the route that Friedkin takes. And I love that. I love that subversive quality. I love that at the end of this film, the murky lines of good and evil and what that means in this world, like that is maintained there. There are no good guys at the end of this film.
Yeah, it just proves that the 80s were a great time for filmmakers to really dare to be a little bit different, right? And not to say that a lot of these filmmakers from this era were making their best films in the 1980s, but they were at least trying new things. And it's not just William Friedkin, but I think of someone like Francis Ford Coppola, for instance, or maybe even a little bit of Martin Scorsese. A lot of these filmmakers were really desperate to sort of shed that 70s influence that they have created to move past that and do something a bit bolder and more complex. And that it's ironic that the film that Friedkin made that was at the turn of that century was a film like Cruising, which is probably his most provocative and controversial film, just given that subject matter. Have you seen Cruising? Is that one that you have seen, or is that a blind spot?
That's one of my blind spots. Yeah,
it's been a while since I've seen it, but that is a very interesting movie, especially given the new sociopolitical lens that we see things through now. I saw that movie back in college for a course I had for my film studies minor, and it was a film class about the representation of the gay community in film at that time. Yeah. And given the the LGBTQ plus community nowadays and the way we view that, it's a film that has, for some, aged really well and for some aged very poorly, and somehow I think it does both. I heard a great interview with I think it was critic Alonzo Duralde on the Breakfast All Day podcast. He was asked about the film Cruising and was directly asked, do you think it's like do you love the movie or do you hate the movie? And he just said yes. But I love that a movie is willing to have literally both ends of that polarity represented there. So I do recommend that one as well.
Okay, yeah, that's one I'll be curious to catch up with. It was on my list. I tried to watch as many as I could leading up to this conversation.
And full circle again, Al Pacino.
Yeah, and especially after hearing his comments about Al Pacino, I was desperate to want to catch up to it. But between everything else I was watching, and I had my birthday shenanigans over the weekend as well,
Yeah.
so I ran out of time. But I will definitely catch up with that at some point. And because everything that you're saying there sounds fascinating to me,
yeah.
especially knowing Friedkin at that time and the kind of filmmaker he was, and how far he was willing to go in terms
Yeah.
of cinema, at least how he defined it,
Yeah.
which maybe starts with the French Connection. I guess we can go back there. I never did see anything prior to the French Connection.
Yeah,
I
I haven't seen The Birthday Party or The Boys in the Band, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I will admit that I do still have some blind spots, not just there, but even some of his 90s films I admittedly haven't seen either. But I do hear that they're still just as provocative, maybe just not for as, I guess, as successfully as some of these other films.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can talk about them here in a little bit. The French Connection, though, is, if there's a contender for his most popular, it is certainly the French Connection. Where do you want to start with that one?
Well, I could see why it is the most popular, because it's the one movie where William Friedkin just directs the shit out of it. Like,
Yes, he does.
like that's like, if you want to just show someone a purely well constructed and perfectly constructed action film, this is a great example, especially as represented in the 1970s, right? And you could definitely see the influence that would have, especially on a lot of 90s films. I see a lot of, like, remember the film Ronin with Robert De Niro from the 90s?
Oh, yeah.
I sense so much of the French Connection in that movie.
Yeah, there's no doubt that film was inspired by the French Connection.
Well, so many of those films were. Like many of those films from the 90s, whether they be directed by, like, Luc Besson, for instance, definitely took a lot from the French Connection. But there is still a lot of nuance in the film, despite the cat and mouse procedural element of it. Like, I do love that Gene Hackman's Popeye Doyle does carry some of the same complicated tropes that we more or less talked about with To Live and Die in LA. It's just more, those complexities are more at the forefront in something like To Live and Die in LA. But a film like The French Connection, and even Gene Hackman's performance, the film it's going out of its way to suggest that he's doing good things to catch these criminals, but he's not really a great guy himself either. He's very rough around the edges. So I like that the film has that too. The film itself is very rough around the edges. It's very visceral. And I think that's why the action beats of the film land as well as they do, kind of in the same way that the horror beats of The Exorcist land as well as they do, because there is a human component supporting it.
Absolutely. And I think what's really great about the film, aside from those murky qualities you're talking about from a character perspective, and I don't know if it's quite as gray as something like To Live and Die in LA, but it certainly plants those seeds for sure. And there's no doubt that it has those gray waters. However, I think what's also fascinating about the film, and I guess To Live and Die in LA gets to this quite a bit as well, but I love that so much of the film, just in terms of a filmmaking perspective, it is all about its visuals, it's about its gestures, it's about it laying out its clues in this organic way. Like, there's nothing about that film that is spoon feeding the audience.
Agreed.
It is bringing everything to the viewer through its chases, through its storytelling, and how these characters would react to the situations they find themselves in. And to me, that makes the action all the more compelling. And simply from a storytelling standpoint, I never find it tedious. And that's where a lot of films, even some of Friedkin's films, we'll probably get to some of them, where they do suffer a little bit because the storytelling at times might get bogged down in trying to feed the audience these little fillers that may or may not be necessary.
Sure.
And sometimes it's hard for a filmmaker to tiptoe around those things, depending on the screenwriter and what they're trying to attempt. But what makes The French Connection, I think, so special is that it's able to bring us all of this drama, the tension of it all, the panic, the cat and mouse chase of it all. It's all done through Friedkin's filmmaking.
Yeah.
And just bringing everything to us organically. And as a result, the tone of the film, it has this tension that just kind of reaches this boiling point that at a certain point somewhat erupts and then just keeps this unrelenting pace going. And it's just incredible.
I mean, yeah, if some people criticize a movie like Mad Max Fury Road for being one long action piece that doesn't end, but you love The French Connection, it almost feels like a contradictory statement, because the movie does feel like one extended chase sequence. But I think that's what makes it so thrilling. It does work as almost a trial run of sorts for To Live and Die in LA, which is my way of saying I slightly prefer To Live and Die in LA, just given the emotional complexities of it. But I will say I do think The French Connection is a more entertaining and overall tighter thriller. But you could definitely sense that Friedkin is trying to tap into some of those procedural nuances, some of the underbelly of this police/criminal world and how that's represented in the humanity of it all. He's definitely tapping into that for sure. But it does make for a very entertaining movie, especially watching, those obsessive qualities of Popeye Doyle, right? Like that's what makes the film so thrilling.
Well, and to me, I think that's why I prefer The French Connection to Live and Die in LA as much as I deeply admire the foreboding qualities of that film that we talked about. But the one thing that The French Connection has that I would say To Live and Die in LA doesn't, but I want to be fair because To Live and Die in LA has a very, very specific purpose that we talked about. It's not.
I think we're talking about two films that are still in Friedkin's top three, or at least arguably speaking.
Yeah. But the difference for me kind of comes down to character and performance.
Fair.
Popeye Doyle, despite the confines that the character is working in, still feels like a fleshed out character. Whereas in To Live and Die in LA, these characters are pawns for Friedkin to work with. And so you don't
more
really
of a mood
get to
piece,
know them
honestly.
all that well. Yeah, it really is. And so I guess it just kind of depends what mood you're in. and
for lack of a better term,
and what you're wanting out of these movies. But
I'm in more of a mood piece mood right now, which is why I'm giving the edge to Los Angeles, I guess.
And look, if I'm wanting something that isn't going to be quite as emotionally engaging or intellectually engaging, then I'll go to Live and Die in LA if I simply just want to chill with a movie. And man, that film is elite at that. I mean, the characters in that film, you might not get to know their motivations and these underlying quirks about them, but they have a vibe. Willem Dafoe has a vibe in that movie that is top tier. It's really great.
It's a great way to describe the movie. The movie is a vibe.
It really
most
is.
Most of Friedkin's movies are vibes. They just have very different energies with their respective vibes.
Exactly. But broadly speaking, the character work and the depths that The French Connection goes, I just tend to slightly prefer.
Okay.
Or at least in this case, if I'm looking at those two movies, I ever so slightly prefer. But we're talking about small differences. You're right; those are two of his very best movies.
I mean,
no matter how you look at it.
Should we just go ahead and reveal it, since I think we're talking about this already? Would The Exorcist, French Connection, and To Live and Die in LA, are those your top three, at least in some order?
No. Because there's one that we haven't talked about yet.
We're going to get to Sorcerer soon, aren't we?
Yes.
Okay.
But those are my four.
Okay.
In I guess maybe we can transition to Sorcerer, because that's a movie that I did not see until this last week for the first time.
Nice.
And there's something
awesome movie.
Oh my God. And there's something about that movie that just, I don't know how to articulate it eloquently. The only way I can say, Brennan, is that this film blew my mind. It absolutely blew my mind, because the whole movie, from a plotting perspective, and I cannot emphasize this enough, all they are doing is driving four drivers. They're from one location to the next. That's it. That's the whole plot of the movie. There's a little bit at the beginning that shows us how these four characters come together. And
Right.
I love the structure of that. But fundamentally, the drama of this film is we got these two trucks. We got to haul these explosives from over here to over there. Good luck. And that's it. That's the whole movie. And yet, it is the most thrilling, it is the most engrossing, the most lavishing, the most terrorizing work of cinema I have seen. Like, it is incredible, that movie. How he takes something so mundane and makes it immaculately cinematic. Like, I think of that moment where they gotta go across this turn. That's it.
Oh, yeah.
The whole thing is we're driving this way, and I guess if you're listening, you can't see my hand gestures, but we're driving straight on this road, and then there's a little bit of a bend to the left. And so one character gets out, and he's waving the guy in the truck, and we cut to the guy in the truck, and he's hitting the pedals, and then you cut to the other guy waving him on down, and then the other guy's in the truck with the pedals. That's the whole sequence, and it is absolutely exhilarating. Like I don't know how he did that.
It's like if someone were to describe, you remember the action movie from the 90s, Speed? But what if the criteria what if the criteria is that if it went below 25 miles per hour, it blew up?
Seriously, like, yeah, that is the perfect way to it is some of the most heart-pounding cinema that I have maybe ever seen. But what is happening, like, from just a logical, literal perspective, from a pragmatic perspective, is insanely mundane.
I mean,
like, there's really nothing that, like, they're crossing a bridge. That's it. Now, granted, there's a big storm. It's a wobbly bridge.
Yeah.
I'll give them that. And yet it is traumatizing, that whole sequence. It is incredible.
In many ways, I feel like Sorcerer and perhaps the film that it was also based on, The Wages of Fear, which I admittedly have not seen, the French film from 1953, it's almost like these movies can now be seen as deconstructions on what it means to make an action movie, because we tend to think of action as, it's about quick. It's about quickness, it's speed. That's where the thrill comes from. But sometimes it's not only in the sense of slow pace that you get from a movie like Sorcerer. It's the surrounding circumstances. It's the natural surroundings that play a part in that level of danger, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I think the film is really interesting, because yes, that bridge sequence, which is, again, it's iconic for a lot of the same reasons as the car chase in The French Connection, right? Just a very different vibe, but perhaps has the same level of, I guess, status, if you want to call it that, from the 1970s with regard to action cinema.
Yeah.
But the camera lingers. It barely moves. It's all about the rain and the natural surroundings around it that make that sequence so complicated and complex. That's where the obstacle is. It's in what those surroundings are, which just goes to show how important sense of place is when you're making an action movie like this.
And also, as much as I love that, the other thing with Sorcerer that I just cannot get over is the storytelling and how he utilizes these four characters, because, and this is a little bit of a precursor to Live and Die in LA as well.
Sure.
In the sense that our four central characters here are not guys that we are endeared to at all. And yet he still has to find a way to make us engage with them. What we're talking about here is an Irish American gang member who helps rob a church and nearly kills a priest at the beginning of this film. There is a French businessman who is trying to embezzle a bunch of money. He does a lot of illegal stuff financially. Then there's an assassin and a terrorist. Those are the guys we're talking about. Not guys with good convictions. These are characters that in any other film, they're the villain.
They are.
They're the antagonist. But in this film, he brings them together as our four protagonists.
Yeah.
And there's a version of this movie where we loathe these guys. And I think there's an element of this film still where you don't really ever empathize with them Or
No,
at
but you
least I
can't
can
take your
understand
eyes
the
off
argument.
of them.
But you can't take their eyes off of them. Their performances are very good, and yet we engage with these little mundane tasks because of the filmmaking, because of the performances.
Yeah.
And you do kind of get to know them enough. There's not a lot of writing to them, but there's
Right.
enough within that filmmaking and within the performances where you get to know them enough. And maybe some of it is just because of the harrowing stuff that they're tasked to do, how
Sure.
they overcome it and overcome these obstacles emotionally and physically, that you just start to maybe root for them a little bit before Friedkin comes to an abrupt halt at the end of the film to go, actually,
Yeah.
that's not how this is going to go. That's
Nope.
not how this is going to end.
Nope.
And he pulls that rug out from under you once again. And we remember that we're rooting for not great people.
Yeah.
And so dramatically he ends the film, I think, in a way that is probably the right call. But also from just the storytelling perspective, it's very subversive, probably challenging for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But I love that. I love that he makes a movie about 4 characters that we really shouldn't care much about. And he does it through incredible simplicity. And yet within the confines of that simplicity, it's some of the most heart-pounding cinema you will ever watch. How he pulled that off is nothing short of a miracle.
Well, and I think that's another thing we have to acknowledge with these movies, and we sort of already alluded to this with regard to The Exorcist and how great of a performance piece that is. These movies are just so well cast because any other actor that isn't as experienced or as talented as the people that are in these movies would lead to that more black and white mentality that you're talking about in any other lesser filmmaker's hands, right? But here in Sorcerer, you have, I mean, Roy Scheider's performance here, I think, is not nearly as talked about enough when compared to, let's say, Jaws or all that jazz.
Yes.
Even his small role in, let's say, The French Connection. You know, we just talked about that film. He's also very good in that one. But I think Sorcerer, I mean, he carries this movie, and it makes me miss how great of an actor he was at that time. Just role after role, he was banging out these great performances, and man, does he add a lot of nuance to this movie that may not have even existed on the page. But when I say not existed on the page, I don't know that for sure, because I'm sure the original French film had that as well. I just haven't seen it, but it is a classic from what I understand. But what he's doing here, I think, is great.
I completely agree. I think this is some of his best work. It just comes in a movie that unfortunately did not do very well at the box office, and its legacy just hasn't been there with the Jaws and some of his more prominent work. But I think his performance is astounding here. Bruno Kremer, I'm probably butchering that name, but I think he's excellent here. This was his first English-speaking role. Francisco Rabal, I think, is quite great. I mean, they're all very good.
Yeah.
And I just love how Friedkin utilizes these characters here that, for all intents and purposes, they're very flawed characters, very prickly characters, and yet we're still utterly engrossed by them. And just the filmmaking, the craft here. I mean, the cinematography as they cross that bridge, I don't know how he pulled it off.
I don't know either.
It's just
it's amazing. It's so good.
It's so good. The sequence where they have to blow up the tree blocking the road, and the drama and the conflict there, and how it all builds up to, because in the film, this is again the simplicity. Like, this dynamite is so vulnerable that any little movement could blow it up. So any little mistake could be the end.
Yeah.
And that one little thing is all you need to create so much tension that freaking takes advantage of. And I just love that film so much. So it doesn't have the legacy behind it as The Exorcist or The French Connection, but I think there is a strong argument to be made that it is his best film. I think there's an argument to be made.
I think at the very least his best directed film from a technical standpoint. I think that argument can at least be made. I know we're kind of already in mid-conversation on how we're slowly ranking these films, and my initial thought is that this would just round out my top 5, but I don't know. The more we talk about it here and now, I might want to put it in my top 3. I mean, this is why his loss is so devastating, because I think we sometimes forget just how great he was, almost like we took his work for granted. We see The French Connection and The Exorcist, but we don't talk nearly enough about these other movies, and in some ways they're kind of just as good.
I mean,
it's incredible.
There are very few filmmakers that could pull off several of his movies.
Yeah.
But especially Sorcerer.
Yeah.
You know, because like you think of something like The Exorcist, and there have been other movies to follow that none of them have reached the heights of The Exorcist, but some of them have used those tropes and created some things that's compelling.
Sure.
The French Connection, a lot of movies owe its gratitude to that movie that have been compelling, or the murkiness of Los Angeles and the police procedural. Sorcerer is such a specific movie that is so, and I cannot emphasize this enough, that is so remarkably mundane from a plotting perspective. They are literally driving from one location to the next. That's it. There are very few. George Miller, as we stated, can do it. We've seen him do it. But there are very few that can make that as engrossing as William. Like, that is such a very unique thing.
Yeah.
That to me just kind of gives Sorcerer a leg up. But that's again, The Exorcist, all-timer. French Connection, elite. To Live and Die in LA, elite. Like, those are easily the 4 for me.
Any filmmaker would dream to have those 4 films in their filmography. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no kidding. So again, like look, I will listen to the argument, not that this is a hot take, that The Exorcist is his best movie. Fine. That's seems pretty clear enough. Sorcerer is still probably my favorite. I think
that might be your number 1. Isn't that really exciting when you see it for the first time, like now, and you just have that kind of reaction to it as if you just saw one of the greatest movies ever made for the first time? It's such a fun feeling.
And that's why I wanted to open by saying, as inarticulate as it is, that he blew my mind. It was that simple. Like, I was like, everything I said, I was thinking about quite prominently as I'm watching this movie. Like, they're turning a corner. Like, they're in this truck, they're turning a corner. That's it. That's all that's happening from a plotting perspective.
And it is the most thrilling action scene of the 1970s.
I almost had to walk away to catch my breath. I just couldn't believe it. Like, there's, and that's where, again, even compared to something like George Miller, like, at least, like, Mad Max Fury Road is this high octane movie where there's a lot happening. There's a lot of vehicles. They're driving much faster. And so, like, as great as that film is, and it's a masterpiece, don't get me wrong, Mad Max Fury Road is one of the best movies of last decade. But you look at that compared to Sorcerer, they're driving 5 miles an hour.
Oh yeah, it's Mad Max in slow motion. Is what Sorcerer is.
And yet it's just as heart pounding.
Yeah,
like, yeah. Anyway,
it's a great
I love
movie.
it.
So,
so yeah, that's the experience I had. I was blown away by it.
Yeah, so good.
Brendan, it's our favorite thing. We got to talk about coffee once again. Oh man,
I'll be right back. I need some coffee.
I know you need it. You need it. I need it. We all love it. I had a cup actually not that long ago. Just right before we're doing the show, so I'm awake and ready to go long into the night.
You're a late coffee drinker. Yeah, I can't quite do that. I need it in my morning as like a sense of therapy for me. It's like my ritual, and I'm just glad that I can have coffee that tastes good.
Oh man, it makes a big difference. That's why we love Coffee Cult. They source specialty grade Arabica coffee from over 50 countries around the world, and they inspect their coffee. They don't use, anything to degrade the coffee. There's no chemicals in it. They don't use broken beans. This is truly quality, unmatched coffee that you just can't get, anywhere else. And I was sitting down this morning and drinking their Colombian IPE. And when this coffee is, like, I buy the whole bean.
Yeah.
So you grind this coffee, and the smell is succulent. I mean, it smells like roses on a warm summer day.
Smells like a candy factory or something.
Honestly, that's a better description because it has these notes of cherry
Yeah.
and blueberry and peach to them. Like, it really does smell like a candy
I
factory.
mean, there's a reason that some places will offer like, coffee, whether it be decaf or not, as part of like a dessert menu, right? There's a reason for that. It fits that mold and that palate very well. And
great.
coffee is good when it actually can function as a tasteful, nourishing dessert.
Exactly. Comparatively to other coffee companies, we won't name, that are milk and sugar companies.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. They take that dessert mentality a bit too literally, and they just douse it in the sweeteners.
When you go to the green and white place, they don't want to brew good coffee because they don't want you to drink it on its own. They want you to put in milk and sugar and caramel and chocolate. Like, they want you to put that stuff in because it's expensive, and also it's not good for you.
Not really.
They want that addictive thing going on there. So, look, if you want to drink that, it's perfectly fair. But, Coffee Cult, it's addictive in a great way. You know why? Because you're drinking the best coffee on the planet. You're drinking unmatched, high quality.
Not even just the taste, but knowing that they are sourced from great farms that pay their workers very well, especially women, and that you're getting a product that's made to order, doesn't sit on the shelf for so long.
Exactly.
It's almost like we all want our coffee to feel like it's personalized for us because we have our own relationship with coffee.
And that makes a big difference.
It's like the product you're getting was specifically designed for you, and that makes it feel all the more important, really.
Exactly. So go to coffeecult.com, coffee with a K, cult with a K, coffeecult.com. Use our code ISF and get 15% off. Again, the code is ISF. You'll get 15% off. That's coffeecult.com. Okay, let's talk about podcasting. Brendan, you and I, we do this every week. We've been doing this for 10 years.
Yep.
And you've been here the majority of the time in that 10 years.
Yeah.
And every week we use Libsyn to host our podcast.
Yep, that's true.
And, this is a service that has over 75,000 podcasts worldwide. They're a combination of liberated and syndication.
Yep.
They have some of the best support staff in the world. They make things super easy for you. So if you want to get into the podcasting game and you need a host for your podcast, look no further than Libsyn.
Yep.
These guys are great. We love them. Honestly, in 10 years, I have zero complaints.
We have never had any doubts or any inclination that we would be switching hosts. We never felt like we needed to. And it's not just the support that we get from Libsyn and the overall housing for our podcast that they've been so good at. The centralization of it all and the work that they do in the back end to help not just our podcast, but every podcast that they support is amazing. And what I love about Libsyn as well is the way that they'll help you learn and grow your podcast, whether it be great audio techniques, whether it be marketing statistics, all those things that roll up into this service. These are things you need to know if you want your podcast to succeed and grow. And it's so helpful in that regard.
Absolutely. They make all of the integration seamless. The back-end stuff, as Brendan is talking about, it's very easy.
Yeah.
And again, if you do get confused on it all, the support staff is great. Excellent. I've had nothing but incredible praise to say about those guys. So, but yeah, it's great. So start your podcast, use Libsyn, go to libsyn.com. That's LIBSYN. .com. Sign up there and get 2 months free when you use the code ISF. Again, the code is ISF. You'll get your first 2 months of podcasting for free. It's fantastic. And again, that's LIBSYN, Libsyn.com. All right. Should we talk about The Hunted? I know. So this is a movie that you texted me and said that you saw, that you watched. in preparation for this, our Patreon listeners will get a fun little story about my experience watching The Hunted for the first time.
Yeah, we might get the APAA involved with that one.
I watched The Hunted in preparation for this conversation, and there's a fun little story that you can hear with our Patreon bonus content, patreon.com/InSessionFilm. Sign up, you can hear it. It's a fun little story. So our patrons will get to hear that. But that is to say, I did watch The Hunted.
Yeah.
For this conversation. And
first time watch for you, right?
First time watch for me.
Same
So
here.
I guess as we get to his 2000s output, because I also want to talk about Bug. But
yeah.
The Hunted. What did you think of The Hunted?
I think it's pretty good overall as a movie, but I think why we need to talk about it is that it just represents everything that we more or less talked about with regard to William Friedkin as a person and as a filmmaker, that he is someone that is never going to compromise, because The Hunted from a narrative standpoint could have easily been this generic run-of-the-mill thriller from the late 90s, early 2000s, one that would have been forgotten about in like 2 or 3 years, right? But again, like with The French Connection, Friedkin directs the shit out of that movie. It has such a visceral, almost dangerous-like quality that is absolutely thrilling. And a lot of it goes back to the sound design of this movie. The sound design is really great. And it's not just the opening war sequence that I think takes place during the Kosovo, if I'm not mistaken, which then leads to our one of our main characters, played by Benicio del Toro, and his suffering of PTSD in a way that almost mirrors something like the classic story, The Most Dangerous Game. There's certainly an element of that here. But the movie does weirdly almost function like kind of a mood piece, and we talked about that already with something like To Live and Die in LA. It's governed by this script and this narrative that could have easily been so heavily bogged down by the procedural element and the way the FBI gets involved. And in a way, I kind of wish the movie was just Tommy Lee Jones and Benicio del Toro in the woods for 90 minutes, and that's it.
I agree.
Honestly, the FBI stuff is really my biggest problem with the movie, but the way that Friedkin still has this handle on tone, and that classic tone that we tend to associate him with, that's why I wanted to talk about the film here, and why I was so glad I gave it a watch for the first time, knowing that he was still able to hone in on his usual tropes and his usual style without ever losing sight of being a director for hire. Because so many directors fall into that trap, right? They'll direct something like this, and it feels like they're just getting a paycheck, that they're not really bringing their classic qualities to it, almost like they're playing it safe. And this could have easily been one of those films for William Friedkin, and I don't think it is. It has a very powerful feel to it that I really did respect, and you do feel it for sure. I think it's a good and entertaining movie. Well, maybe not entertaining. It's kind of a devastating movie, honestly. But I did like it. I like the Friedkin aspects of it, that he just came to play.
Yeah, I did like the film, especially if you're willing to succumb to the freaking isms of the movie.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and I agree with you. Like, it is very well directed. I love Tommy Lee Jones. Love Benicio del Toro here. I think they give pretty good performances. This is a film, though, that I do think gets bogged down in its tropes a little bit. And some of that could simply come down to execution, because when I watch something like Sorcerer or The French Connection or To Live and Die in LA, I don't think that these films do suffer from its action depictions, where this, I think, does. And for example, you know, because I feel like I'm talking in vague generalities here. But there's a moment in this film, and I guess for a little bit of context, Del Toro's character of Aaron is built up to be this assassin that is, you know, on the run. He's a loose cannon, but man, you don't want to mess with him. He's a dangerous killer. Killer.
Yep.
Then you have Tommy Lee Jones as LT, who is also quite potent in his own right, but he's also a little bit older now. Somehow, though, this assassin can get on a bicycle and ride in, you know, like the wind. Somehow, LT not on a bicycle, just running after him, just somehow was able to like keep up with. And like again, like that's such a silly little thing, but there's something about the editing and execution of it that stands out.
I think
in
it's
this
because
film.
it's in a movie where the narrative itself and just the overall storytelling feels kind of disconnected at the same time, that you tend to
Maybe
notice
that's
some
it,
of those
yeah.
things. Because like we said, this movie I think would have been so much stronger if it was just two people in the woods hunting each other.
Yeah. And I think maybe that just kind of comes down to storytelling and how you use these characters, because I kept thinking about this, albeit in the last few hours, because I just watched this film, but something to, compared to like the Bourne trilogy or something to that effect, where there's the cat and mouse game and there's a lot of action involved. But when I'm watching Jason Bourne, I don't get caught up in the minutia of, he's running, this guy's on a bicycle, and does that logically I don't know. I honestly can't even tell you an example of that,
Right.
because of the storytelling and how the action is, depicted in those movies. And here, I agree with you. There is a disconnect between the storytelling and the action and maybe the performances. And so the film is far more disjointed than Friedkin's best work. But I do love the characters on their own terms and how the film kind of funnels this film allegorically through, was it the story of what's the biblical allegory at the beginning of this film?
Abraham?
Abraham. Yeah, that's what it is. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I should have known that.
I was going to say, you're a bit more theologically tied than I am.
Yeah. My theological background definitely. Look, it's been a long night.
It failed you.
I got a newborn in the house. That'll be my excuse for the next year and a half. At any rate, yes, the story of Abraham, and from a plotting perspective, I actually kind of admire the illogicalness of the film in that regard, because like there's a couple of moments here where where Aaron should have easily have been caught. Like the FBI has him surrounded, should be caught, but he somehow gets free. And you see LT following him through the ringer and doing all of these things that, given his age, he probably shouldn't be able to do. But there is a thematic reasoning. So as much as I don't love the logical reasoning, the practical reasoning, the thematic reasoning and the emotional reasoning, I think, is really great, right? Because it comes down to this father-son thing, that Abraham has to kill his son.
Yep.
And so him going after Aaron and him being the one to, spoiler alert, to be the one at the end to do the deed.
Yeah.
Like, it's not as much, like, it's not about LT getting to him first, because he's dangerous. It's getting to Aaron first because he's dangerous, and he knows that the FBI cannot match him in those dangerous.
He knows he's dangerous because for lack of a better term, he trained him. He's a product of LT's, essentially.
And he doesn't want the FBI to get to him because he doesn't trust the FBI's level of skill sets. He thinks that Aaron will just kill these guys at will. And we do kind of see that earlier in the film, right?
When
they try to capture him at that warehouse or the subway or underground, wherever they are.
Or what he does to those two people in the beginning.
The hunters. Look, he's a skilled assassin. The film demonstrates that a couple of different times. So,
which is where it most reminded me of something like The Most Dangerous Game, for instance, where it's someone that sees humanity as the most complex of objects to hunt because they actually will be the most resourceful. So there's actually a challenge there, right? Yeah. And that then, feeding into Aaron's own dealings with PTSD, which they never really talk about directly, which I kind of admire. It's Friedkin, using Benicio del Toro's performance and creating this overall mood to trigger those feelings of PTSD as an after effect of war that you do at least sense, which I think is a nice storytelling touch there.
And that's interesting because, or intriguing is maybe the better word, because I do think there's an argument to be made that is exploitative, that we're using PTSD as a trigger for him to do quote unquote bad things.
Yeah.
Whereas on the other end of that spectrum, if it becomes the Hurt Locker, for example, then, maybe you risk being a little trite and derivative.
You also got to be a little direct with it and a bit more literal with those themes to actually have something to say about it. Whereas here it's, on one hand, you're right, it's kind of used as a plot point, but at the same time, the way that Friedkin does use it as a plot point to complement the film's mood, as if you're almost suffering the same things that Aaron is going through. He makes you kind of feel those things.
Yeah.
So the fact that he doesn't over-explain it is kind of also part of the charm. It's like this weird, like tug of war between what he should have done and what he should not have done, and somehow it's both.
Well, and that's where, coming back to the idea of freaking not wanting to spoon feed the audience, I think is effective here, because he allows Del Toro more than anything else to deliver those qualities in the character, and we can certainly interpret it however we want. But I think Del Toro does a good job of channeling that PTSD, and also kind of like the film. And there are, I guess, to be fair to the writing, there are a few cues here that are subtle. The film doesn't really go into it in depth, but like there's the moment where we hear him in the truck and those government agents are like, "You killed this family." And he's like, they had guns. They were trying to kill me. But the film doesn't expand on what that means. We never really find out what happened there.
Right.
So we have to interpret, is this PTSD getting the best of him, which is what the government agents are implying, or
was he trained to be something more and something else? Then there could almost be like an almost I guess conspiracy like nature in the way
it is a
that
little conspiratorial.
Yeah.
And so Del Toro is threading that needle of PTSD and emotion and how overwhelming that can be, but also there's a cogency to the character at the same time.
Yeah.
And so it's not necessarily leaning one way or another. And that certainly makes him effective from a physical, like from a menacing perspective. So like, I think on the whole, Friedkin does a good job, because he doesn't spoon feed us anything that, and he lets Del Toro carry the weight of it. And Del Toro is very good here.
Yeah.
That I that to me is not nearly as much of a problem as it is the disjointed nature of the storytelling. But symbolically, the whole father-son aspect of it, the Abraham stuff of it, I think is really good. And, the idea that he has to get to him first because the FBI doesn't stand a chance. And he knows that.
Yeah.
And so it has to be the father that it has to get to the son. And there is a saddening quality to that. Like when LT, delivers that final blow, there's no sense of relief. There's no,
you're right.
Fist in the air moment. Like it's just this somber, it's over.
Well, and I think a lot of that is because of just the knife fight itself and how Friedkin shoots it. And again, the sound work there. When you see and even hear those knives stab the other person, right? Like it actually is kind of painful to watch. There's not much that you see, so it's not as visually grotesque as maybe a slasher movie might be, for instance. But Friedkin is so good at creating brutality in what you don't see, and I think this is another great example of that.
The other thing I love to what you're talking about there in terms of the physicality, the violence of it, the sound work involved. The thing I really love about Friedkin and his direction in this film is how pragmatic the violence is. Like there are so many action films that will prolong or heighten the violence for dramatic sake or for cinematic sake. This is a film where like you get stabbed and that's it.
Yeah.
Like the knife fight at the end takes about 15 seconds.
Yeah.
Like,
a great knife fight, but you're right. It actually means something to be stabbed by a knife in a movie like this.
Or like the car chase is over before it begins.
Yeah. There's a literal gravity to this, right?
Yeah. Like there's like, I love that there is a practicality to it that like, there's no like stabbing someone and then they sit there and they slowly die and the blood's draining and there's this melodramatic moment. Like, nope, it's stabbed, dead. Like, like that's kind of how this film functions.
Yeah.
I may be embellishing that a little bit, but that's more or less how that.
But
that
you make a good
here.
point. We don't often see knives being used as this visceral of a weapon, right? Where like it gets the job done that quickly. Because in actuality, it probably could, right? Depending on how it's used. And this movie gets knife science right, if we can call it anything.
I mean, I think the fighting in general, just the carnage we see, however, in whatever form, and there is a lot of knife work, but in whatever form, it happens rapidly. Like it happens quick. There's no prolonging the fight. It's not like John Wick, I think, is a great example of prolonging stuff. Partially because there's a bazillion guys he's got to kill. But or I mean, and maybe that's a bad example, but there's a lot of examples where, you see the fight and it's extended or borderline melodramatic because we gotta heighten it.
Yeah,
and this happens.
There's a
very
time
quickly.
There's a time and place to praise action movies for being acrobatic, and then there's a time to praise action movies for lacking acrobatics. And this one lacks the acrobatics because that's the point.
Yeah,
and I like that.
The only time where this is heightened is in keeping pace with Aaron from LT's perspective, because he's an old guy.
That one chase throughout Portland is perhaps a little heightened at times. Well, there's even one scene where you actually see LT jump off the top of a house, and you see it from a distance. You actually see that stunt person land on it looks like he broke his freaking leg, and he just rolls and gets up and runs away. Like there are a few moments like that just to keep up with the plot, but those are pretty few and far between, though.
Yeah, the violence itself has a pragmatism to it that I do appreciate. So there is things to like about The Hunted. Not my favorite, but I do.
It's not my favorite either, and I caught up with it because it's short. It was available on Max, so it was an easy watch, and I hadn't seen it before. But I was also curious, knowing the reputation of Friedkin's later work, especially in the 90s. We sometimes see that happen with a lot of legendary filmmakers from the 1960s into the 1970s. Some people claim that they quote unquote lose their way, and there are some filmmakers that maybe fall into that category, unfortunately. But I was really curious about this one because I wanted to at least see whether the movie is good or not. Does it at least still feel like a William Friedkin movie? And for the most part, it still does. It could have easily fallen into the director for hire trap, like I said, but I don't think it does. It might when it comes to some of the procedural FBI stuff. But everything around it is still so visceral in the ways that William Friedkin is best at.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like he was handled this material. He wasn't wholly in love with it, but felt compelled enough to do it, especially if I can get Benicio del Toro and Tommy Lee Jones.
Yeah.
And then he kind of makes it his own. So like it's his thumbprint is there even if it's not his best work.
Yeah. Agreed.
And then there's Bug.
Bug rules.
The most bizarre film in his filmography, but I love it. Like it's so good.
I feel like, if Friedkin were to direct more films after both Bug and Killer Joe, especially if they were based on stage plays, I think this could have signaled a new rebirth of him with Bug.
Yeah.
And it's I guess it's ironic that both Bug and Killer Joe are based on plays by the same playwright, Tracy Letts, who is known for being a bit of a provocateur himself with his work. And there's also the film August Osage County, which was based on a Tracy Letts play, which also has some of the same provocative tendencies in a very different way. I actually think Friedkin was at one point tapped to direct that film before it went to John Wells, which would have been really interesting, almost like the Tracy Letts trilogy presented by William Friedkin. That would have been really interesting.
Yeah.
But I do think these two films based on Tracy Letts' work I think they're among Friedkin's better films. And it's because they're so contained and so claustrophobic, especially Bug, which literally gave me schizophrenia when I first saw that film. It freaked me out. And I still don't know what the movie is ultimately about, but it is a bold and daring vision. It really, really is. And when we talked about it briefly during our 2006 retrospective, I think it was, That did make my top 10 of that year. I don't remember if it made your top 10, but it was just
let
at
me
the bottom
look.
end of my top 10 when we published that list at
Let's
that
see.
time.
I do have it here. 2006.
I think so. Yeah.
It's not on my list. No.
Okay.
But
I at least had
really
it probably
like
around number 9 or 10 or something like that.
And I will say this, looking at it now, and I haven't wrestled with this since we did our 2006 retrospective, but
Oh, they always change.
yeah, for sure. Like there are definitely a few films here I feel like I could swap it out for,
Okay.
at least in that 11 through 20 slot.
Interesting.
Because I do really like Bug quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I do remember revisiting it for that show. Man, there's some really good films here on this list that I really love.
2006
yeah.
was a good year. Pretty good year.
Yeah, I mean, looking at it now, like if we were to, I guess, like we did for 2014 when we revisited that year and kind of shifted our list a little bit.
Yeah.
If we were to do that, let's say next week, I would probably make room for Bug. There's
Okay.
no doubt about it.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So I mean, I do really like it a lot, and I haven't rewatched it, but it is one of those films that'll linger for you. Like you just won't forget watching a movie like this. It's so unique, especially in the context of his filmography. There's really nothing else like it.
Oh,
It's
no.
so distinctive. It's unnerving. It gets bizarre in the best ways, and I love these performances. It's easy to think about The Exorcist or The French Connection, as we talked about. And I did invoke Michael Shannon earlier, but I think this is one of those movies in his canon that has some of the best performances in them. Do you agree or no?
I think collectively speaking, because all three of these main characters, I think, are portrayed so well, and I guess the three being Ashley Judd, Michael Shannon, and even Harry Connick Jr. is really good in this movie. I think they all have this proper level of escalation that a film like this needs, because without these performances, the way that the film just tonally shifts as often as it does, it would have been the most jarring, unpleasant in a bad way, but very jarring and inconsistent experience. And yet, like we talked about with the performances in The Exorcist, a good performance knows how to rein those things in a little bit. Which is what I think the three of them do here very well.
I agree. No, I think they're fantastic. They tap into this sense of paranoia or this unnerving quality that the film taps into quite heavily as it goes, and then by the end, it's just all kinds of insane, and I love it.
I mean, I don't think I've ever heard a movie where someone screams, "I am the super mother bug," and I find it to be utterly terrifying and not that funny. So,
yeah, because when you say it like that, it's hysterical.
Absolutely is.
But that's the kind of the brilliance of it, though, right? Because
Absolutely, yeah.
It is supposed to be hysterical and weird, like on its own terms.
Well, and hysterical, not in a funny way. I mean, but definitely evoking.
I guess what I'm saying is it can be read that way. Like if you just read it on its own terms, like just take freaking out of the equation and the performances, and you just read that on its own terms, like that's a little silly. And then you watch the movie, and that's not silly at all.
No,
it's
that's the brilliance of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the irony I'm trying to articulate here. But
yeah. So between this film and Killer Joe, both based on Tracy Letts's work, do you have a preference between the two? Because I almost feel like they work as I mean, they're not really companion pieces from a thematic or narrative standpoint.
Yeah, no, they're very different. Yeah.
Yeah, but from a directorial standpoint, the sense of like unrelenting, provocative dread that they both provide, I think they challenge audiences in similar ways that you can almost see them as companion pieces within Friedkin's own filmography. Do you have a preference between the two?
I will say this. I think both films are his best work since To Live and Die in L.A. in 1985.
I think that's absolutely fair. I would agree with that.
Of the two, I might slightly prefer Bug.
Okay.
And maybe that's because it's so vividly distinct to freaking Killer Joe is really good.
It is a little
But
more controlled when
it's
compared to Bug.
controlled, and I feel like it's a slice of freaking we have seen before. So it's not as distinctive, but I think given what it is, and you mentioned earlier that there is this sly humor throughout a lot of that film as well. So like it kind of has this comedy inside the confines of all of the tension that is thrown in there.
Yeah.
And that's not always the case with his movies. I mean, The Hunted, no comedy. There's no
none.
Like, To Live and Die in LA, maybe a moment or two. Sorcerer, absolutely not. Exorcist, no. French Connection, maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
So and like Jade, it's been so long since I've seen that film. Same thing with The Guardian, so it's hard for me to really say, but I don't recall.
The Killer Trees movie.
Yeah. So like, so I think of like, I guess how unique it is in that regard, and that certainly is appealing.
Yeah.
But I mean, Bug is just, and I love it, and I love the performances in it. I don't know, like it's
back and forth for me. That's why I asked.
Yeah.
It definitely goes back and forth for me. I definitely respect Bug more for its unrelenting vision. But again, it's kind of like how we talked about some of these other films and how they function as great performance pieces. There's something about the performances in Killer Joe, just as an ensemble piece, that I go back to maybe a little bit more often, but it's Friedkin's direction I go back to more often with regard to Bug. So it can go back and forth. I will say in my overall ranking of the films of Friedkin's that I have seen, I do have the films back to back. They are next to each other in my list, and I don't think that's a coincidence.
So what is your top 5 then?
So my top 5 right now, I know the order might change, especially given the conversation that we just had here. My number 1 is The Exorcist. That I don't think will change. Before this conversation, my number 2 was To Live and Die in LA, and my number 3 was The French Connection, and my number 4 was Sorcerer. But after the way we talked, I'm almost tempted to put Sorcerer at number 2. It's just given the fact that there's not a moment of wasted space in that movie.
No,
as far as
not
just
at all.
How you construct an efficient action film that really has no action whatsoever.
Yeah.
Like there's an ironic brilliance to that.
Yeah. And I love the ambiguity at the end too. It's kind of that To Live and Die in LA thing, right? Where
in many ways it is kind of the bridge between To Live and Die in LA and The French Connection, right? It has the rewatchability and the thrill of The French Connection, while even further alluding to those nuances, that humanity of To Live and Die in LA, right? There is the fact that there's a literal bridge in the movie might not be a coincidence. I think that's representative of where he was going.
Touche.
Yeah. Nice job, Friedkin. You're bridging the gap here nicely. Yeah. So I do know, and I feel like that's a pretty common that we might not be too far off. The norm when it comes to most people and how they feel about his films. But I do think they might be his best 4 films, and then that 5th spot would. Again, go back and forth between Bug or Killer Joe, depending on my mood.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. And I'm obviously in a similar boat. If I'm bucking the trend at all, it would be having Sorcerer at number 1.
Okay.
But I do think if we were to have a large poll on this or a survey with Film Twitter, I have an instinctual feeling that I wouldn't be in a minority there.
I think those would be the top 4 if we did a full poll of his films.
Oh, for sure. I'm speaking specifically to Sorcerer at number 1. I think there would be, again, if we're just talking cinephiles and film critics, maybe not the larger mainstream audience.
Oh, I mean, yeah, but like
I think a lot of people would have Sorcerer.
The bridge between general audiences and critics, I think, do love Sorcerer. My dad loves Sorcerer. That's how I first saw the film, is that he showed it to me when I was really young. And it's interesting. It's a PG rated movie, which is kind of surprising, just given the tonal brutality of it and just how thrilling that it is. And then it got me thinking, there's really nothing in that film that would warrant like an R rating, right? It came out in 1977, which predated the PG-13 rating. So it could have been one of those cases that if it came out after 1984, when the MPAA put that rating in place, thanks to Gremlins and Temple of Doom.
Yeah.
I could see Sorcerer falling into that same category. But yeah, it's to get back to the point. My dad loves this movie, so it does fall into that same spectrum of people who probably saw it at the time, even if it didn't get its due. People did like it. Audiences did like it. At least it has a fan base now.
Which is to say, I will concede that The Exorcist is arguably probably his best movie, but Sorcerer I'll put at number 1. The Exorcist 2. 3 would be The French Connection, To Live and Die in L.A., and then, like you said, Bug, Killer Joe, flip a coin.
Yep.
Maybe Bug 5, Killer Joe 6.
And then at number 7 of those I've seen, I would probably put Cruising, just given the provocative nature of that one.
Okay. Well, there you go. That's where we stand on the late, great William Friedkin. And I think he has a movie coming out later this year, actually.
I believe it's completed, if I'm not mistaken.
It is completed. The Kane Mutiny Court Martial, I believe it is called, starring Kiefer Sutherland, Jason Clarke, Jake Lacey, and also the late, great Lance Reddick in his final role. So that is being premiered at the Venice Film Festival in September next month. So that should get a release later this year, and that'll be his last movie.
Yeah, it's sad to see him go. I'm going to miss him dearly, but the fact that we still have one final film to look forward to from him, that's at least, if there's anything to say that is exciting about any of this, that's at least something there.
Yeah, and it's been 12 years since Killer Joe came out, since the last time we had seen, I think he did a documentary in the meantime.
The Devil and Father Amorth?
Yes.
I haven't seen it. I haven't heard good things about it. I hear it was pretty bad. So I never gave it a chance, sadly.
Yeah, I don't know anything about it either. But as far as a feature film goes, it's been 12 years since Killer Joe, and this will be his last one. So we'll whenever it is released in the fall, obviously we'll get to that, and I'm looking forward to it. One last freaking ride.
Yep.
Before he sets off into the sunset, but yeah,
I like how you said that, freaking ride, almost like you said freaking ride.
I know, exactly.
Nice play on words there.
Very much looking forward to that. At any rate, we will end the show there, but let us know if you agree or disagree with any of our thoughts. I'd love to hear your list and how it might differ from us. You can hit us up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, email us InSessionFilm@gmail.com. Or if you're watching on YouTube, you can always leave a comment below, hit that like button, subscribe, leave a comment, all that fun jazz. Okay. Yeah. As we wind down here, just want to say thank you to all of our patrons. We cannot do this without you. Your support on Patreon. That's patreon.com/InSessionFilm. We have an ongoing series that we recently started where we have exclusive Patreon content every single week. We've been having a lot of fun.
Yeah.
We talked a little more Harry Potter on this week's Patreon exclusive.
We're not done yet.
Like I mentioned earlier, I have a fun little story that is relating to Friedkin, so you can go and check that out as well. As far as podcast reviews go, we will have a review for Theater Camp coming up. David Rosen from Piecing It Together joined me for that.
Oh, nice.
And then I think Brendan and I are going to discuss A24's Talk to Me.
We're finally going to talk to each other.
Finally going to talk to each other. I think that we're going to get to that one very soon. And I have thoughts on that movie.
Oh, the horror guy finally saw a horror movie.
Yeah.
And I say that ironically because I know you're not really a horror guy.
No,
you kind of are. You kind of are. You're just a big scaredy cat.
I was going to say, I'm actually going to speak to that in the review. Like when we get to it, I will talk about my experience kind of leading up to it.
All right.
So be on the lookout for that. Women in Session, their latest episode is up. They did a critic spotlight on our own Zeta short. That was a lot of fun. Please go and check that out as well. I mentioned social media, email, leave us reviews on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all that sort of fun jazz. Brendan, any final thought before we get out of here, my friend?
I got to start hunkering down. For those that live in Northeast Pennsylvania, man, the storms have been so bad this year. Not even just Northeast Pennsylvania, just the Northeast spectrum of the country, honestly. They're calling for more potential tornado warnings tonight.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, possibility. We're not at the tornado warning yet. In fact, we might not even get them, but I might have to end up hunkering down in just a little bit. It was pretty scary the last time that they called for these. I was at Maris's parents' house, and her, myself, and her mom and the 2 dogs went in the basement, and the second we got in the basement, all the lights went out.
Oh, wow.
It's like, that's like the worst way to introduce the possible threat, right? It's like this, like all the power goes out the second we make it down there. It's like, well, crap, this might be coming right for us. And apparently it was pretty close. I think a tornado did land maybe 10 miles or so away from us. So it was just, we were able to sense kind of like a growling kind of sound. So if there's anything that the movie Twister gets right, it's that growling sound that you hear. That's a pretty accurate statement, or at least accurate depiction of what that could sound like. But yeah, that's been happening here. That's not fun. It's not fun.
Yeah, it doesn't sound fun. I typically don't have to deal with tornadoes, although this time last year, if you recall, there was that massive hurricane that hit on the west coast of Florida, like up in Tampa. Well, we caught the outside of the ring of that as it was hitting Tampa. And so as a result, there were some tornadoes in the area, and there was one that hit our neighborhood pretty good.
Wow.
Now, our house was spared, but some of our neighbors were not so lucky.
Wow. It's so scary. That's a scary thing, man.
It is. But so the tornadoes, we don't really deal with all that often, but thunderstorms are like a daily occurrence in Florida in the summer.
Oh, yeah.
Like all the time, sometimes multiple times a day. And it's like clockwork. Like on my way home, raining every time. And it'll get home like
this is why I couldn't live in Florida.
Like, and it's funny because like we signed up Sam for this summer soccer clinic, which was 2 days a week, Tuesday and Thursday. And I don't know why we decided to do this, because every Tuesday and Thursday at the time he's supposed to go, storming. It literally was canceled almost every time. I think they played like 3 times out of like a 6-week schedule for 2 days a week. They were all rained out.
It's just such a waste of a league then at that point.
Oh yeah, no, it's.
Oh dang, that sucks.
But anyway, that's Florida. So
yeah. I'm glad I don't live there.
At any rate, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We will see you all next time on the InSession Film Podcast. Brendan, he was turning a corner.
The power of freaking. The power of freaking compels you.